I have a number of unsettling stories that are tied to local forests. I grew up in these forests and feel quite comfortable here. Nevertheless, I stumbled into a few unsettling situations there that would firmly stick in my mind forever. This is one such occasion. I was 18 at the time. One evening, me and my two friends, Mike and Paul, decided to go camping. Well, camping maybe isn't the right word, since we didn't intend to spend the night, only to chill and have some fun around the campfire for a while. The plan was simple. Head out, build a campfire, drink a few bottles of wine, eat something, and head back home for a good night's sleep. We met at my house when it was still sunny outside. We got ready and we headed out. Our destination was an old abandoned quarry in the middle of the woods, which was maybe 40 minutes from my house. Even though the quarry has a tragic and frankly creepy history, it's a popular place for such occasions. When we got there, the sky was already colored red as the sun slowly sank behind the hills. We quickly gathered all the firewood that we could, so we wouldn't have to look for it later. As darkness fell and absorbed all of our surroundings into impenetrable darkness, we already managed to get the fire going. We were in a great mood, and we were all getting ready for our first toast. That's when we realized that we'd made a horrible mistake. We forgot the corkscrew. We were trying to open the wine without it, but we quickly gave up because the bottles were quite expensive and we didn't want to damage them. At this point, it was clear that one of us would have to sacrifice himself and jog back to retrieve the corkscrew. If we decided to stick together, we would lose so much of our valuable time. We would have to put out the fire, pack our stuff, and hike back with backpacks, which would inevitably slow us down. It was far more practical for one of us to jog alone, since it shaves some 10 minutes off the time it takes to get there. After a bit of haggling, I volunteered. However, I had two conditions. Firstly, they would give me the hatchet in case something went wrong along the way. Secondly, no pranks when I got back. Mike and Paul agreed without hesitation. They shoved a hatchet into my one hand and a flashlight to the other, and sent me on my way. As I was jogging through the forest, I heard a noise resembling a wild boar. Suddenly, I remembered a warning I'd received from an older hunter a few days ago. He said that this time of year, boars were getting dangerous, especially at night. I was a bit nervous, but luckily, I managed to survive with no harm. I arrived safely to my house, much to the surprise of my mum, who didn't expect me so early. I explained the whole deal, and she just laughed. I grabbed the corkscrew and was back on my way. Not wanting to experience an unpleasant boar encounter, I chose another, slightly longer path, this time through an open field. After a while, I got to our spot. It was a small clearing surrounded on one side by massive rocks, maybe 70 meters tall, and on the other side by thick forest. Somewhere in the middle of the clearing was our campfire. When I approached it, I realized that there wasn't anybody, although our backpacks were still on the ground, and the fire was burning bright. Great. We specifically agreed that there would be no pranks when I got back. Those dicks think that they're funny, I thought to myself. I resignedly sat down near the fire while facing the woods. That's the only place where those two arseholes could have hidden, I thought. I was really tired, and all I could think about was the taste of that exquisite Pinot Noir we brought with us. I really wasn't in the mood for their games, and I was getting quite mad. That's when I heard a snapping of twigs and rustling of leaves from the edge of the forest, maybe 30 meters from where I was sitting. The sound was rhythmical, and it was undoubtedly the sound of somebody walking. I aimed my flashlight at the spot where the sounds were coming from. Between the trees, I spotted a tall person wearing a dark hoodie. As I shined my flashlight on him, he stopped walking, turned to me, and just kept staring motionlessly. Even though he was directly facing me, I couldn't really see his face. I shouted, "Paul, you fat bitch. I know you're trying to scare me. We agreed on something, so stop messing around and come out." As I finished, the hooded figure turned around and walked deeper into the woods. Exactly at that time, my phone started ringing. Hastily, I took it out of my pocket. It was Mike. I took the call and started barking at him. "Really funny, you assholes. I thought we agreed on something." "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about you trying to mess with me. I clearly saw you, so you can come out now." Mike, as if froze for a minute. For what seemed like an eternity, all I could hear was his heavy breathing and Paul mumbling something in the background. When he finally snapped back to reality, he just said, "Dude, we're at your house. We heard some footsteps. At first, we just thought that was you trying to mess with us, but then we got scared and decided to look for you. I forgot the phone at your house, so we couldn't even call you. Just get the hell out of there and we'll come back for our stuff together." "That's bull. That's just another one of your funny pranks and I'm not buying it." "Hold on a second." For a while, all I could hear was some incoherent mumbling. "Hey, what's going on?" asked the voice of my mum coming from the phone. My head suddenly spun and my heart skipped a beat as I realized they weren't kidding. Suddenly, a freezing wave of fear ran through my body. However, I managed to convince my mum that everything was just fine and that she didn't need to worry. She gave the phone back to Mike. "Just leave everything and come back. We're heading out now. We'll meet you halfway there." "I'm not going anywhere alone again. You'd better get your asses here and do it quick. I'm waiting for you." "But..." I hung up. I didn't want to make any more noise than I already did. I quickly turned off my flashlight and started to back off from the light of the fire. I moved all the way to the huge wall of rocks. I figured that if I had my back covered by the rocks, I would eliminate one of the possible ways the unwanted visitor could approach me. I was standing there in complete darkness, trying not to make a sound while tightly clutching my hatchet, which would be for the next half an hour, waiting for my best friend. I had to constantly convince myself not to curl up into a ball in fear. Even my own body started to betray me, as my hearing got worse due to my savagely beating heart. I was trying to calm myself, but then again, in worst case scenario, every little bit of adrenaline would help. After what seemed like an eternity, I spotted 2 weak light beams coming from the forest. I heard Paul shout my name. I've never been so relieved. I finally ran out of my hiding to greet my 2 friends. For quite some time, we were just standing there, laughing like maniacs from relief. We were even getting a bit cocky, and we thought about staying. After all, there was supposedly just one creep lurking between the trees, and there were 3 of us. Funny, just minutes earlier, I was crapping myself with fear, and now I was suddenly full of tough macho thinking, what could possibly happen? In the end, healthy judgment got the better of us, and we decided to leave. We packed our things, put out the fire, and got out. We took our bottles of wine to enjoy somewhere else. Somewhere where it's nice and brightly lit. When I was growing up, I used to spend the majority of my summertime out at my grandparents' ranch. It was far out in the middle of nowhere and surrounded only by cow pastures and woods. From the house, I would have had to walk a few miles to get to the next door neighbor's house. I can't think of a better place for me to grow up, honestly. I loved every second of being there. My older sister and older brother also enjoyed being out there too, which was both fortunate and unfortunate. We had great times together, inventing games of chase, building forts, Camping, hunting, shooting, climbing trees, hide and seek and telling stories. We must have crawled over every nook and cranny and tree within a mile radius of the house. We used to make up all kinds of ghost stories and tales of adventure about places we would go. Most of them were supposed to be scary or creepy, mainly to terrify me. We had the beast of the silver mine, the ghosts of the big rocks, the chupacabra of Round Mountain, the old keeper of the bunkhouse, or the fountain train man of the tracks. As young and impressionable as I was, between 4 and 8 years old, I believed all of these to some extent. Well, one particular summer, when I was about 8 or 9, I was out there without my siblings. I used it as my chance to explore on my own. I wanted to test out all those stories and prove I was a big girl and not scared of all that stuff. Ever one to face things head on, I started making trips to conquer my fears. Every couple of days, I would specifically go to one of the storied areas and show myself that there was nothing terrifying there. I bravely camped and made s'mores by myself out of the big rocks, and what do you know? No ghosts. I even stayed there overnight during a rainstorm in the old bunkhouse, just a leaky old wooden house. Well, one particular day, I decided my new target was going to be the train tracks. I figured that if I could walk down the tracks until I got farther than I had ever been with my brother and sister, I would be cured of that little fear. Anyway, I pack up a lunch, fill up some water bottles, and head out. I wander through the woods, idling around for a while to build up my courage, and reach the train tracks after an hour or two. The woods were beautiful that day. Little speckles of sunlight shining through the treetops, small animals fleeing before my passage. I reached the edge of the tree easement around the tracks and felt my heart come up into my throat. I knew they were just stories, but I swear I could hear that damn conductor swinging a bell. But I was a big girl of 8 or 9, and I was not going to admit to my siblings that I was too scared. I timidly trudged up the embankment to the steps and stepped over the rail. In that moment, I just knew the story was going to turn out to be real. Honestly, for some reason, that story was more real than the rest to me. It was solid in my brain, but the tracks were serene, peaceful, quiet, abandoned as they always have been since I'd known them. I started walking down the tracks, singing the theme song of Paladin. I knew it from Stand By Me, and keeping my head on a swivel for a headless conductor coming to steal me away to a phantom train forever. Anyway, I walked down the tracks to a small shack I had seen before in the company of my brother and sister. I was on the opposite side of the tracks from my grandparents' place, and I had never actually crossed the tracks before myself. So this was sort of new territory for me. It was a worn-down old shed, built probably 50 years ago out of 2x4s and lumber scraps. I decided this was going to be my test. I would enter into the shack and maybe even bring something back if I could. I slowly approached it, still expecting a phantom to leap out at any moment and grab me. As I got closer, I saw something new. A small, light blue pickup truck was in the woods behind the shack, parked just out of sight of any casual observers. Suddenly, with someone possibly being here, it made it all the more important to myself to reach this shack, but I started to go a bit more stealthily now. I got right up next to the shack wall and found out that the weather-worn planks had separated from each other, leaving small gaps in between the boards and a dim view of the interior. Far be it from me to turn back now. I pressed my face up against this narrow crack to preview the interior. Unfortunately, the daylight outside was too bright, and my eyes took a few seconds to adjust to the dimness inside the shack. When it did, I saw the shack was in fact occupied. There was a small figure huddled on the ground. For the few seconds I watched, I saw it whimper. I was so startled, I took a step back from the wall. I looked away from the crack to see a man step around the corner 20 feet away from me. He looked utterly ordinary and normal, but something about the whole situation made me want to run. I obeyed the feeling. I ran immediately up to the train tracks and back towards the house. I ran as fast as I possibly could. With pure animal instinct to flee driving me, I ran down the tracks. I guess I got him by surprise, because I remember managing to make it to my cutoff back to the house before I looked back. He was just feet behind me. I dodged into the woods, jumping over limbs and branches, the advantage of knowing my home turf better than him, allowing me to increase the distance between us. At some point, possibly the entire time, I let loose a wordless scream of terror. I knew I was nearing the house, and I think I was just stuck in pure flight mode. So my scream continued. Suddenly, within view of the house, he crashed through the woods just ahead of me. I tried to dodge around him and get to the house, but he grabbed my ponytail and jerked me down backwards to the ground. About that time, I heard a shot ring out. My mother was standing on the back porch with a hunting rifle, firing into the air. The guy let me go like I was on fire and ran back the other way. My mother and my older brother had shown up while I was out that day. She ran out and dragged me back into the house. I blurted out the entire story, everything I had seen, and she took my brother out into the woods, down the tracks, and to the shack. I'm not quite sure of how long the time frame was between me showing up and them leaving, because I was a bit crazy-minded flea status still. I know they came back with a small child about the same time that the cops showed up. The police claimed custody of the child, and that's where my involvement really ended. Apparently, the kid's story is that his parents got a divorce, and the dad figured it would be a good idea to kidnap the kid and run away. Possibly to Mexico. I don't really know. Alaska is the perfect place to go if you want to get away from the rest of the world. As America's least densely populated state, you have plenty of breathing room from any kind of authority or prying eyes that may want to know what you're up to. For this reason, my home state is very attractive to all sorts of weird and unsavory groups. I've stumbled across Scientology centers at the end of a dirtback road with nothing else for miles, heard stories from doomsday preppers who claim to have bunkers made out of shipping containers in the sides of mountains, and met people who've come out of religious cults in the interior that wanted to keep their followers away from any contact with the outside world. All of this and more you can find in Alaska. I was born and raised in Anchorage, the only big city in the state. Growing up, we had about 250,000 people. In a city, it takes about 30 minutes tops to drive across, so that gives you an idea for what we up north consider a big city. The only other real city in the state is Fairbanks. These two cities are connected by 360 miles of a 2-lane highway. It's a 7-hour drive one way to get between them, through one of the most beautiful landscapes on the planet. Mountains rise up on either side of you, between Anchorage and Denali National Park, before you drive through these colossal canyons carved out of the rock over tens of thousands of years by melting glaciers and rivers. Past Denali is another 3 hours of driving through a vast, flat interior plain with mountains in the distance. I say all this to help you understand just how desolate it is in Alaska, even on the highway. After you get out of Anchorage or Fairbanks, there is nothing but wilderness as far as the eye can see. save for the small occasional small town with a maximum population of about 1,000 people on a good day. 10 years back, it was even less. Alaskan girls are built tough. We change tires, hunt, fish, camp, and generally have a great appreciation for the great outdoors that women in the lower 48 don't really have if they're near a city. The joke is that Anchorage is the biggest rural city in the country. All this brings context to the following story. In high school, things were different, or at least they felt different. I was a young and stupid woman who thought I could conquer anything due to the aforementioned built tough attitude I was raised with. Senior year of high school, I decided to treat myself to a camping trip into the mountains, up past Talkeetna. Nothing fancy, just an overnight or two in the most beautiful state at the most beautiful time of year, mid-June. Going up north in the peak of summer here has a weird feeling to it. The sun never really sets. If you've ever seen the movie Midsommar, that's what it's like. It gets to about dusk, and that's it. It's still bright and sunny out the whole night through. The false sense of security I had, thinking that the midnight sunlight would mean safety, probably nearly got me killed, or worse. My second mistake was not telling anyone where I was going. I just packed up for my trip, stopped at a Subway for a lunch, and headed out into the great beyond. The drive was fine. A solid 2.5 hours of driving north along the highway took up most of the afternoon as I jammed out to the greatest hits from the radio on Cool 97.3. After you get through the Matsu Valley, you get into the mountains again. Tall spruce and evergreen trees line the road on both sides, with the occasional empty space where there had been some clear-cut logging. All of this gives you a sense that while you're out in the wilderness, you're still connected to civilization in some way. This led to my biggest mistake, not staying at a state park campground. I was in high school with only a part-time job and didn't want to pay the $15 overnight camp fee and was too scared to risk the fine, so I found a spot that looked good and pulled off the road. The map I got from my dad said there was an old mining site up a nearby mountain, so I decided that would be the best spot to head for an overnight. My logic must have been that it was badass to spend a night in a mining ghost town or something. I pulled off the road, packed up my backpack, put on some bug spray, grabbed my map and compass, and started off into the woods. Now, this hadn't been the first time I had done this. I've been on wilderness backpacking trips on my own with my dad through my childhood. I knew my orientation skills and had taken some wilderness survival courses at camp. I wasn't just some dumb blonde wandering off into the woods with no idea of where I was, or so I thought. A solid 45-minute hike up into the hills, and I finally made it to where the old mining camp was supposed to be. There was nothing there, just an old concrete foundation with some holes in it and nothing else. I was very disappointed but unsurprised at the outcome. I set up camp off in the woods and set to building a fire for dinner on the concrete slab. Here, you're supposed to set up cooking a ways off from your camp, just in case bears become nosy. Last thing you want is a 1,300-pound grizzly poking his nose in your tent, wondering why you smell like Campbell's soup and s'mores. By this time it was getting late, about 10 p.m, but the sun was still high in the sky, and by the time dinner was over, it was nearly 11. I was starving, so I dug in. About an hour later, it was about as dark as it was going to get, so I hunkered down in my tent for the night, confident that the overgrowth was private enough for whatever animals might come out around then. I woke to voices in the distance and slow moving crashing through the underbrush. My first thought was hunters. My dad and I had run into a few on some campouts, so it wasn't uncommon. I relaxed and figured they would just pass through without incident, and closed my eyes again. That's when they found my fire pit. A man's voice cried out into the brightish forest, "Who the hell is camping on our property?" I froze. I knew I had messed up and was getting up, grabbing my purse and putting on my shoes so I could go apologize before I heard the man again. "When we find you, you're dead. You're on private militia property and trespassers get shot." That's when the whole situation changed. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't just pack up my tent with some armed guy lurking around. I carefully put my shoes on, put my keys in my purse, and slunk away into the underbrush as quietly as I could. My thought was to slip away, wait until they got bored and left, then go back, pack up, and leave. I spent 20 minutes hunkered behind a log in the woods, barely in earshot, before I hear a second voice calling for the others. They had found my tent and were tearing it apart, going through my stuff. I heard one shout out, "Bed's still warm," and "Trespassers a chick. She left her underwear." The first man shouted out, "Okay, fan out and find her. Bitch thinks she can trespass, then there's gonna be hell to pay." At that point, I wasn't concerned that I had left my spare change of underwear in my bag, or that these creeps had found it. I needed to get out of there. Quietly, I made my way down the mountain for a good 30 minutes, tiptoeing and taking care not to step on twigs or make a ruckus. After the rustling and shouting of the men had faded quite a bit, I said screw it and booked it as fast as I could in the midnight sun down the hills. I tripped and fell and got scraped up more times than I'd care to remember. Finally, I made it back to the road, but much to my horror, there was no car. I knew I had come out up or down the road from where I had been. I couldn't remember where I was at the time, but picked a direction and started walking. I rounded a corner on the road and saw my car, and the two men standing beside it. They were armed and dressed in surplus military gear. I hid in the bush on the side of the road and watched. A while later, several more men appeared from the trail I had taken. They dumped all of my stuff next to my car, hopped back on their ATVs, and drove off. I went up to my car, careful not to be seen, and found a note on my dashboard. It read something like, "If we ever catch you on our property again, we won't hesitate to use force. Consider this a warning." I was operating more on instinct than any rational thought. I had a hand over my mouth to keep from screaming at some points, and when I got in my car, I completely lost it, sobbing uncontrollably and screaming for probably a solid half hour. I went back to start loading stuff into my car and noticed what they had done. They had cut up or destroyed all my gear, probably as punishment for trespassing. Honestly, I'm thankful they did that because I'm grateful I didn't get shot. Ever since then, I've taken great care to camp only in designated camping areas. To the weird Alaskan militia group, I know you weren't actually going to kill me, but nevertheless, let's not meet. Me and my ex were camping at a campground in our local national park. There were like 3 or 4 other tents on this tiny island, connected to the lakeshore by a tiny bridge. We had been sitting around the campfire for a few hours with the other campers, smoking and having a good time. It's late August, pitch black outside. You can't see anything except the immediate area surrounding the fireplace. Everyone else goes back to their tents. I grab my camera and tripod and go set it up for some long exposure shots. I walk maybe 150 feet away from the fireplace and tinker with it for a few minutes before leaving it there to do its thing. When I approach the fireplace, I notice a dark figure standing just behind the bench my girlfriend is sitting on. I try to make eye contact, but this guy is just staring at the ground. I'm stupid high and starting to get scared, so I muster a half-assed "hi" and sit down next to my girlfriend. My girlfriend is even more scared than me because unbeknownst to me, He's been asking her some really sketchy questions. Are you alone? Where's your boyfriend? And so on. We sit there in silence, staring at the fire for a few minutes before I tell the guy to sit down. He was still standing behind us, a bit to the side. He starts asking questions about whether there are any other campers on the island and whether we all know each other. We are starting to get really scared. He points at my spare camera body on the ground and makes some comment on how it must have cost a fortune. For the next half an hour, he just sits there, barely speaking, never once showing his face behind his hood. I remember sitting there with a knife clutched in my hand, watching his every move like a guard dog. When the adrenaline starts to clear from my head, I get up and tell him we're going to sleep. He barely notices it, and when we start packing our stuff into our tent, he gets up and leaves. Fast forward to an hour later, we're laying in our tent, scared witless when a flash of blue light hits our tent. My girlfriend remembers that he had a head torch. We are really scared now. We hear some steps. I stick my head out of the tent, half expecting to get a hatchet as a forehead ornament. I can't see anyone or anything. No headlamp, no nothing. This repeats itself a few times during the night. We get a few hours of sleep and pack up our stuff to get out of there. On the other side of the tiny bridge that connects the island to the lakeshore, we see him again. He just looks at us while we walk away, not responding to our friendly waves. This always really creeps me out to think about it. To understand my story, you sort of have to know a tiny bit about trespassing laws in my country, in that we don't have any so long as you're respectful and non-destructive. You can walk over any hills you like in my case, camp on any beach of your choosing, so long as once you leave, the area is how you found it. I used to love camping when I was little. Our family would go multiple times a year with a large group of my parents' friends and their kids. On average, there were maybe 10 of us at a time, but was a little logistical challenge since we always headed out to this one really remote beach on the coast. Actually, we weren't the only ones. There were always yachts bobbing just off the shore with people in them, and other campers lining up and down the beach. Most of them also had children or teenagers, so it wasn't a wild party scene. It was very much an informal family holiday spot. There were even small buildings with toilets and showers installed nearby, even though this was in the middle of nowhere. I guess the local council must have figured it out and got sick of people peeing behind bushes. We took a trip in spring of 2011. I'm really bad with time, but I know this because I got my dog in winter of 2010. After picking her out that November from the shelter as a birthday gift from me to me, as I paid her adoption fee, Parmesan came to me as a 6-month-old puppy who had been rescued from a dogfighting situation. We're not entirely sure what breed she is exactly, but my best guess is a Lurcher Staffy mix. She's a wonderfully well-tempered dog with people and most dogs, but you absolutely do not threaten her. She'll have you. So by the time of this camping trip, I'd had Parmesan for a few months. She had never come camping with us before, but as far as my family are concerned, dogs go on camping trips. So when we piled into my car, she came too. Unfortunately though, none of the family friends could make it, so it was only me, my sister, my dad and my mum. I didn't mind. I wasn't that attached to the other kids. I'd rather play with my dog and I'd still have my sister. The drive took the best part of 6 hours, and because we'd left a bit later, although I don't remember why we'd left later than normal, we arrived at sunset. Not a good time to be building a tent, but we'd expected to arrive to other campers already set up, and the beach illuminated in campfires. The beach was empty. I live in Scotland and this happened in the Highlands, fairly remotely. The drive took so long because we always used this one really specific beach, and the car was loaded down with camping supplies, 2 small children and a dog, so the car was heavier than normal and P-breaks were frequent. Despite the beach being empty, my parents started taking stuff out and trying to build a tent. They asked us to fetch some of the lighter bags from the boot of the car while they sat pointing a flashlight at the sand to see properly. I rolled down the window of the car for Parmesan before getting out. It was pretty hot for that time of year, and I wanted her to have air. Always gotta be looking out for my furry little homie. As we're fumbling about in the dark on the beach, in the middle of nowhere, it's pretty spooky. The one road that led to this beach was circular and had a bridge over the water, meaning you could basically circle around the beach like a big O shape if you felt like it. I wasn't really paying attention to the road. I was complaining I was tired, as kids do. After maybe 15 minutes of my dad trying to nail the tent into the sand, my mum asked him if he had seen a car drive round. It's been a few times. My dad kind of shrugged her off. He's sort of like that. I don't know if he said anything back to her, but after a few more minutes, a car pulled up next to ours on the road, and someone got out. It was maybe 15 or 20 feet from the cars to where we were, and the light was pretty low, except for the torches. We weren't expecting to see anyone else out here at this point, and I think my mum said it must be the security. I don't know why a random beach would have security. I think what she meant was the Wildlife Trust or something, as they do occasionally come down to do their nosy. This guy was walking pretty unevenly. He must have been drunk or high because he had that stagger to him. There was absolutely no way this guy was sober. Cool, a junkie. Not an unusual find, but it's rare to see them in the wild. As he walked into flashlight range, we realized he was carrying a large knife, maybe 15 inches, although I was small at the time, so maybe my sense of scale was off. I don't like my dad, but credit to him, once he saw this, he got up immediately, holding on to the camping mallet, and put us all behind him. The man began to shout wildly at us that we can't camp here, and he was just letting us know. My dad tried to initially be a bit low-key with the guy, and told him that was fine, we'd leave, but this didn't work. He kept coming closer to us, so my dad started shouting, and the man kept shouting back. My sister and I were crying. I remember shaking. I was utterly terrified, as I'm sure anyone would be in that situation. It really did seem like this guy and my dad were going to fight, and I'm going to be honest, I didn't fancy my dad's chances. While it's grim to consider, I'm absolutely convinced he would have killed my dad, and possibly us as well once he was done, as I don't think my mother would have had the common sense to run with us. I love her, but she's always put my dad and her relationship with him above us. This isn't how it went down. A bolt from the black, like a wolf descending on its prey, took us all by surprise. Most of all, the man with the knife. In that moment, Parmesan was the apex predator large canines represent in nature. She got him good by the arm and clamped down hard, ripping his jacket and shredding his skin underneath. He dropped the knife as it had been in his arm that she got him by. He kicked her, he punched her, and eventually got her off. He grabbed the knife from the sand and ran back to his car and drove off. Parmesan didn't follow him, she stayed with us, muzzle covered in blood. Quickly as we could, we gathered our things and all got back into the car, all pretty shook up by the incident. I looked Parmy over, she was okay, but the car's window was much more open than I had left it. We think what happened was when the shouting started, she must have put her paws up on the gap I'd left for her. As it was an older car and had the rolly down windows and not an electric button, we think she must have been able to hit it with her paws and force it down enough to squeeze out. This is not the end of my story. We were all pretty scared, and since we had the dog with us, we couldn't book into a hotel for the night. My parents decided just to drive home so we could all feel safe. But first, had to drive to the nearest town for petrol as they were kind of low. I spent the time trying to clean Parmesan up a little. I had always loved dogs, but what she had just done for me blew my mind. As we drove into town, we came across a petrol station, but it looked closed. My dad drove out closer to get a better look and stuck his head out of the window to get a better look of the sign. My mum asked him what on earth he was doing, and he told her he was trying to see when it opens. Never. My heart sank. Parked in the corner behind a van so we hadn't seen him at first was the man with the knife. He was sitting on the bonnet of his car, using some tissue paper to clean up his arm. It looked pretty bad. Without stopping to refuel or look anywhere else in town, my dad drove right out of there. He decided to go to the next town over, but this was no good. The next town over was 60 miles away, and as we began driving, we realized that he didn't have that much petrol. We were going to break down. "That's fine," Dad said. We had AA cover. They'd come tow us home, or at least to somewhere acceptable for the night. Better than staying in the last town. After driving for maybe 5 minutes, lights flash us from behind. Another car. The same car the man had been driving. It was him, following us. He must have realized we were low on petrol. The next half hour was one of the worst half hours of my life. I had a complete and utter breakdown, as did everyone really. I could tell my parents were trying to keep it under wraps, so it wouldn't upset us, but we weren't really little kids. We were both double digits. We knew how dangerous this situation was. Dad turned off the radio to conserve petrol, and the man followed us for 55 miles before he peeled away onto another road. Our fuel meter was on the big red E for empty for the last 10 miles. We were driving on fumes. I don't really believe in God, but if he does exist, that was definitely one of his miracles. Once we got there, we drove into a petrol station and refilled to a full tank before driving the rest of the way home. My sister and I slept in the car after that. I only woke up once we made it all the way home. Just grateful nothing worse had happened than that. After getting some sleep, my mum phoned the non-emergency line for the police and reported what had happened. They never got back to her after that, but apparently the woman she'd spoken to said they may wish to in the future, as he matched the description of a suspect wanted in relation to a murder charge. No idea if he actually was the guy, or just some random psycho. As I said, they never got back to her. So what's the takeaway then, other than crazy man on the beach, let's not meet? Well, for me, it's that I love Parmesan. She's still with us now, old as the hills and twice as grisly, as one of my mum's friends likes to joke. I don't know why she did what she did that day. I couldn't tell you what her thought process was. What I do know is that this poor puppy was born into an environment where they abused and neglected her, only to be rescued and taken to a shelter where her mother and siblings all found homes before her. Despite how badly people had treated her, when I took her home, she forgave but never forgot. I think the saying is, I never trust a person who doesn't like a dog, but I always trust a dog when they don't like a person. They have a very good understanding of human body language, and I think she must have understood how much danger we were in. If you're able to, please adopt. You might find yourself in a situation like mine one day. I promise you, if you're willing to save a four-legged friend's life, they will pay you back tenfold if they're able to, without a thought for their own safety. I paid £78 for Parmesan's adoption fee, which is a lot when you're a kid, but it chills me to my bones knowing that if I hadn't been so insistent on a dog, I might be dead. It was early spring 2016, and I had just turned 24 years old. My friend and I had reached our main spot to camp. Black Canyon Rim Campgrounds, just outside Payson, Arizona. We would usually travel out here 2 or 3 times a year. It has some incredible views and is only a couple of hours away from the city. For the most part, this area was pretty secluded. A privately owned convenience store rested a few miles away, with a small town 20 miles before that. The entrance was on a dirt road, directly off the highway, with a campground sign at the start of the road, marking local wildlife, any fire hazards, and general news relevant to camping folk. The pathing is mostly linear, with maybe one fork spanning several miles. We once traveled down the dirt road to see how far it would take us. One of the paths would take you to another highway entrance, with a ranger's tower halfway there. The other path led to a dead end. An abandoned cabin could be found on this path, a few miles in, mostly hidden off in the distance behind some larger foliage. The snow had mostly cleared up at this point, leaving for crisp air, a slight chill, and fauna becoming active again. We'd usually spot some wild horses, several deer, and a ton of little critters whenever we'd come out this way. It really was the perfect time of year for a relaxing trip to get away from the city for a few days. We got in around 4 p.m. on a Tuesday. It was late for us, as we'd usually try to make it out there by noon at latest. But this trip was pretty spontaneous. We both had work during the coming weekend, and decided to just go for it. The sun was setting fast, and we still hadn't picked our spot to camp. There were maybe 2 other groups, both families, parked somewhat close to the entrance, only a few hundred yards away from the highway. This time round, we just wanted to get away from the humans for a while. Customer service jobs will do that to you. We drove down the dirt road, past our usual spot, and finally picked the perfect area. A small clearing, just hanging off the edge of a hill. The whole valley could be seen from this area, with a beautiful sunset. This would have been our main spot from then on, if the next night's incidents never happened, that is. We agreed to get a campfire going, and would just avoid building a tent this trip. We didn't have much time to do so anyway, and her car wasn't that uncomfortable. I'd sleep in the back seat, and she'd take the passenger seat. With the window slightly ajar, we'd have a few blankets for each of us, and would fall into that unrivaled slumber. The next day went fairly uneventful. We just decompressed. I had this strange feeling throughout the day though, like we were being watched. There were crunching of leaves just out of sight every few hours, but I figured it was just the local wildlife doing their thing. My friend didn't notice anything unusual, so I didn't dwell on it. Night came, and the feeling still hadn't gone away. My friend must have felt something she didn't vocalize though. She took some of her sleeping pills. She didn't usually need to take them on our camping trips. The nature's ambience was enough to put anyone to sleep, I thought. It was nearing 1 a.m. My friend dozed off in the passenger's seat, while I attempted to wind down in the back. I leaned against the side window behind the passenger seat, legs outstretched to the car's back door. The window opposite me was rolled down slightly, with a cold breeze flowing in. I had been on my phone, scrolling through Facebook or whatever, when I heard something outside. A few crunches of fallen leaves, several paces outside the car. I whispered to my friend, "Did you hear that?" But she was already out. I put my phone down and listened intently for a minute or two. Nothing. It must have been a small animal, curious of the camp. I went back to my phone, scrolling through social media. About 10 minutes had passed when I heard it again, right outside the door. I lowered the phone. My eyes took a moment to adjust from the light of the phone into the deep dark of the woods. As I turned the phone away from me, the backlight illuminated the window above my feet. To this day, I can't get the image out of my head. Two dirty, scabbed hands held onto the window, the fingers wrapped inside the car. The nails were long, unkempt, and dark. Behind the window, a silhouette of a face was pressed up against it. The breath would create condensation every few seconds. All I could make out were the reflections of those empty black eyes. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. It felt like an eternity. The staring contest between me and this thing. Thoughts were repeating incessantly in my head. Why haven't they run away when they saw I noticed them? What were they planning? Is this the face of death? After probably 10 seconds of not doing anything, the hand slowly unclenched the window and receded into the darkness. The condensation on the window dispersed. Another couple of seconds passed before I heard the dreaded crunching sound, melodically fading into the distance. I still just sat there. What the heck just happened? Why didn't I do anything? Why am I still not doing anything? With that thought, my body shot into adrenaline. I pounded on my friend's seat, waking her from her slumber into a dizzy confusion. I unlatched and kicked open the back door, and took a moment to scan the area. Whoever was there, whatever it was gone. I scrambled to pick up any important camping supplies we left outside, and just crammed everything into the back seat and trunk, periodically looking over my shoulder, listening for those footsteps. I slammed the back door shut, and there they were, a grim reminder of the horror that just happened. 2 handprints imprinted on the window. I quickly wiped them off the window in a panic, a reaction to erase the event, I guess. I jumped into the front seat, started the car, and floored it out of there. My friend, finally coming to, asked me what the hell I was doing. "We gotta go," I said. "There's someone out there." I didn't see whatever or whoever it was while fleeing the scene. Speeding down the dirt road, my friend insisted I slow down, and I eventually did. We reached the highway, and I proceeded to drive 20 or so miles before we reached a Denny's, where my friend asked us to stop to eat and explain everything. The nightmares subsided a few months later. My embarrassment continues to this day for the state of shock I was in at the time. Everybody says you either have a fight or flight instinct, and I'm confused whether I have either. I mean, I just sat there and did nothing. I feel what kept me frozen was the fact that they didn't make any sudden moves when I noticed them. That was the most horrifying part of this whole thing. A peeping Tom would retreat in a second, I think. Whoever or whatever this was not worried in the slightest that I saw them staring at me. I frequently tend to ask myself who was out there. Another camper messing with us, a resident of the abandoned cabin down the dirt road, or maybe something more paranormal residing in the forest, watching lone, vulnerable campers as they drift off to dreamland. We'd still go camping there in the years ahead, but never too far from the highway. Whatever it was, I hope that was the last I've seen of it. Something I've realized growing up year by year is that this world can be an amazing place, but it is filled with some super sick people, and unfortunately, I've seen that side of our world firsthand. I'm a very social person and love the opportunity to hang with friends whenever. I'm also the type of person who's always looking for the next big thing. I guess I should tell you, I was a 17-year-old male at the time of this story, and have a decent-sized friend group of both boys and girls. Throughout high school, we had done a lot of crazy crap together. Being just out of high school, we wanted to do something insane together before departing for college. and we all decided to go camping in the middle of nowhere for 3 days. Fun, right? And for some miracle, all our parents thought it would be fine. So we had 6 people going, me and my girlfriend Stephanie, my friend Brendan and his girlfriend Kaylee, and Steve and his girlfriend Sarah. We had decided to have 3 different tents for each couple, for reasons you could probably guess. Being a former Boy Scout, I was aware about everything we needed to survive for the 3 days. Food, water, and other essential supplies. Being rebellious teenagers, we also stocked up on plenty of booze and weed for our fun getaway. So, mid-July, we depart for our camping vacation. After hours of driving down back roads, we eventually find a place that looks secluded, but not too sketchy like some horror stories. There were houses nearby, but not too close. Again, we weren't looking for a sketchy woods to camp in, but unfortunately, no service. It took us at least an hour to get everything set up. While the girls and Steve finished setting up camp, Brandon and I took a look around while fetching firewood. We eventually came across a cool-looking trail. We weren't too concerned, because there was a house within a mile radius, and we assumed that those people had used this trail to hunt, which was big in this area, or animals used it. If you're wondering about our car, we drove a Honda Pilot, which was Steve's. That has plenty of room for us and our supplies. We parked the car rather close to the site, so we had eyes on the car at all times. The first night, nothing much happened. We rolled a blunt and drank a bit and called it a night. The next day, we decided to explore the woods a bit, but Brandon and Kaylee stayed behind to watch the site and spend time together. We decided to go down the path we found earlier. Around 20 minutes down the path, Steve spots a metal fence. We approach it to find a cemetery. The cemetery looked old, but there were signs of activity there. And no, not some voodoo stuff or cult, like flowers and notes left. And beyond the cemetery, we saw a bigger trail that had tire tracks and a half-assed parking lot for the cemetery. We ventured down the path a bit more and spot some deer, then head back because it's getting late. That night, we really partied hard because we were to leave the next day and didn't want to return with extra beer or weed. Now, this night was the polar opposite of the other night. The other night was peaceful, and we assumed the same about this night as we began to turn in. Boy, were we wrong. Now, you would assume that there would have been warning signs earlier in our trip, like a rusty knife on the path or foot tracks around our site. No, not at all. All of us woke to a blood-curdling scream coming from Steve and Sarah's tent. As we hear the fabric being ripped by what we assume to be something sharp, I guess Steve hit the guy really hard with his flashlight and was able to get both himself and Sarah to the car. Now here's the issue. Steve's tent is closer to the car, while the other 2 tents are closer to the trail. So to get to Steve's car, we had to get past whatever attacked Steve and Sarah. Luckily, all our drunken selves were gone because before getting into his car, he yelled "cemetery," and it clicked in my head. The trail on the other side of the cemetery. So I quickly grabbed Brandon, Kaylee, and Stephanie and started running towards the trail. I used my phone flashlight to help see. You might think, why would you turn on your flashlight? Well, last thing I wanted to do was miss the cemetery and be lost in the woods with the guy who attacked Steve. By the time we got to the trail, Steve and Sarah had gotten the hell out from the site, and we could hear the guy chasing us, but from several yards behind. We were able to find the cemetery rather easily, and I hop over the fence first. When we all get over the fence, we notice Steve had not arrived yet, so we all hid in the cemetery. Luckily, to our advantage, it was pitch black by the time I turned my flashlight off, and we all hid in complete silence. My heart dropped when I heard the metallic shaking, as if someone was climbing over the fence. The guy had tracked us down, probably due to the fact that Steve yelled cemetery. We all stayed still as we heard the ground crunch as the guy took slow steps. When in fight or flight moments, you're capable of a lot more than you would think, and your brain is put on some super high alert mode. As the guy approached, I realized I had my small Swiss Army pocket knife in my pocket. As the guy's steps grew closer to me, when he was right about on top of me, I grabbed the knife and lodged it into the back of his knee. The guy tumbled to the ground with a shriek of pain and a metallic sound as he dropped his weapon. Soon, the pair of headlights came around the corner. Steve had made it. We all got up and ran towards the car. While I got up, the light gave me a glimpse of the guy. He was tall, bulky, and had the look of pure hatred in his eye as he clutched the back of his knee, and by his side, a huge machete. I was the last one to get in the car, and even before I fully closed the door, Steve floored it out of there. The girls were bawling their eyes out. We drove until the first house, where we politely knocked and asked for directions to a motel or something. It was a friendly old couple. They told us there was not one for miles. They took us in and gave us warm food and a place to rest for the remainder of the night. In the morning, the man brought his hunting rifle with us to retrieve our stuff from our campsite. When we got there was nothing stolen, but all our tents were slashed up. The elderly woman called and made a report while we were gone, and when we got back, the officers were at their home and we gave our statements. The officers said there's not enough evidence to find the guy, but he promised a search. We headed home later that day. No one said a word on the way home. We were all processing what really happened. The police unfortunately never found the guy. Yeah, college split us up a bit, but we barely talk about it as a group, and it's been a year. We didn't see any no trespassing signs or private property signs. I would find it hard to believe it was private property. Why was the man there? And if it was a case where it was his property, how come the police couldn't find him? My advice to all of you is please find a populated place to camp. I don't care if it's some Yogi Bear camp. Be in reach of help and the police. Stay safe, guys. Please.